We should be recording now. There we go. All right. Today's September 24th, folks. We are getting close to the end of the year, but at the end of our time together today, I'll just share a brief overview of what we can expect in our last few COPs before the holiday break. All right. And then yes, as we typically do, right? If you're curious about what we talked about at our last session, that was a session on credit transfer and advising. We heard from three of our colleagues, Tara Frick, Lisa Cox, and Sandra Kimberlane, on their various perspectives around transfer structure and systems, policies and procedures from the 4-year perspective, right from the 2-year perspective, tips and tricks on advising, and how to think about the transfer student journey in a holistic way. Now, we know it's easier said than done, right? Transfer is a tough sport, as my colleague Dan would say. So again, what we wanted to focus on this month, right, with a little bit of continuity from last month, is what to turn to if you have an idea for change or for improvement, and how to structure the approach that you take towards improvement, right? So that you can kind of keep budgets in check and keep your sanity in check as well. And Beth will be walking you through some of those frameworks and tools in our conversation. All right.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'll jump right in. I invite everyone on the call to please come on camera and ask questions as we go. Let's not save those to the end or wait till there's a quote unquote convenient moment. That's the one thing about improvement work, is that you live in the moment. It's quick, it's sharp. And so don't let those ideas, those concepts, those questions you may have pass us by. So some of you, I did notice, have been a part of a NIC. I did kind of peruse the attendee list, and I saw a couple of folks. So hey, jump in and help me out as we go through this conversation today. And I really do hope it is a true conversation. So as you already know, my full-time job is with Teach for America Appalachia, doing innovation work and continuing to be with the council, the collaborative, in a space with NASH to work on vertical in-state transfer, to improve the number of students who transfer, and to do that in a couple of different ways, more seamlessly, with less extraneous credits at the time to degree completion. So a little bit about NASH, if you're not very familiar. They've recently gone through a name change. It used to be the National Association of System Heads, and then that was under Nancy Zimpher's original leadership. And then Nancy kind of quasi-retired. There was an interim, and then they got a new director, and then he stepped away. Jason stepped away, and then we went back to an interim. And so now, lo and behold, Nancy Zimpher once again is leading NASH. But it was in the interim that the name change happened. So if you're wondering where that came from, I know the first time I saw it, it was a little, I was like, that's not exactly the right name, but this is the official branded name, is the National Association of Higher Education Systems. Founded in '79 with the purpose of trying to improve, or seeking to improve, organization and governance of public higher education systems. So they've been around a while, and they have a lot of different outreach and policy and other practices. And of course, the improvement science work fits into to their grand design. So they are serving somewhere around, or the systems that are involved with NASH is about 75% of all of America's public 4-year colleges have some representation in some piece of NASH work. And that's pretty impressive. When you start thinking about that footprint and how many millions of students that is, it's a very large footprint. So for our conversation today, and we're thinking about improvement science being in other different work fields, you know, it's not new. It's been around for a very long time. It's actually very grounded in healthcare. It's very grounded in the military. Just a couple big names that would resonate with you. But moving it into the higher education space was new, and that was about 4 years ago, when the Innovation in Healthcare Improvement, or IHI, and Carnegie got together and worked with NASH, and Juliet Price, I know you all are familiar with her name. She was instrumental in that adaptation. And so when we think about a best practice when it comes to improvement science in higher education, that's really pretty new. And so we're building that. We've been building that over the last 4 years. But since improvement science has been around a very long time, when you learn a best practice or they've learned a best practice, it does take the time to get there. So if you're thinking about your campus and you're thinking about the higher education space, how long do you personally think it would take to know if what you're trying or you're working towards what we call scale, how long would that take for the broader community to accept that as a best practice? And you can pop your answers into the chat. Just out of curiosity, let's see what the field thinks. So we're saying some years, some months. Would be great if it was that quick. Exactly, Dr. Brooke. 40 to 45 working business days. that's a PDSA cycle. That'll make a lot more sense to you guys later. The answer really is, and I'll skip to the next slide and kind of do the spoiler alert, right? So if we're talking about what does it take to cross the chasm of what we know can work to what we know works well and how to make that work across different contexts and truly become a best practice, it's about 17 years, so medicine advances quickly, but then when you hear, gosh, it's a 17-year delay, it's kind of hard to figure out then how can you do that quicker and with more surety in such a space as a higher education. And the way we found that works is through these improvement communities. When we began this journey 4 years ago, there were 4 systems. And of course, Kentucky was an original system, and we had a 2-year and a 4-year partner team who attended that. That was Western Kentucky University and South Central Community and Technical College. And honestly, in full disclosure, we just threw a bunch of spaghetti at a wall. Like, we had an aim and we had an idea of what would work. We had some data, but we really didn't know how to connect dots with that. And so over the course of the last 4 years, there has been numerous other teams join our merry band of transformers. And so we're up to 16 systems, and most of those systems have minimally 4 different institutions participating. So we've completed somewhere around 400 plus tests of change. They have really gone into great detail about what worked, what didn't work. That's also very important, because in this world, failure is celebrated. It's not anything to be afraid of. You just learn one more thing that didn't work. And so when you start pulling at the strings of what really worked well, what didn't work well, how does that look at a division, say like a flagship institution compared to a community college, you start getting your best practices to bubble up quicker. So we do things a little quicker, obviously, kind of laughing at the nod to the 40 to the 45 working days. But if you're getting through multiple tests of change in a year and it's being experienced across the nation at different levels, at different system numbers, at different institutions, you see pretty quickly what will work and what will not work. So that's important, because as we start to think about how do we close up this leaking pipeline, and we have 100 ninth graders who you start out and they only 69 graduate, 41 are going to go to college right away, 33 are hanging in there for that second year, and only 19 actually get the bachelor's degree. It becomes pretty important that we share those best practices and what's working at a very quick clip. And so that's where we are. So let's think about this a little bit more. When you think about students at your institution and how they experience the transfer journey, right? How they begin, how do you know they want to participate in transfer? How do you know that that's their end goal? Because a lot of times, those of us who've been in a community college know that sometimes students really don't even make that decision till, like, I don't know, 2 weeks before they graduate. And some know when they walk through the door. So when you think about this whole process of transfer in the journey, what are some of the major points that we currently measure for progress? And then what do you wish we measured for progress? And that's not on your slide. That's just me ad-libbing there a little bit, because I think when you think about what we are measuring and what you wish we could measure, that may be a little different look. So if you would, in the chat, please share what we currently track and what you would like to see us track. What would be a better metric? Persistence, retention, and graduation. Yeah, we're already tracking that one for sure. Okay. Well, let's look at what we are actually tracking. So some of the things that we look like are these key milestones, you may say, is when they actually enroll, when the student actually enrolls at KCTCS, right? And a little peep into the next part of our conversation is when you begin improvement work, your team has to really kind of figure out what we call is the launch pad point. Some institutions refer to it as the starting line. But for our purposes today, when we're talking about what are the milestones in transfer, we're talking about the actual physical point of completing the enrollment application, right? And so I'll happy to elaborate on that a little bit more in the future, on the future slides. So we know they're enrolled. They've intended to be transferred. They've verbalized that probably during their original course enrollment. And then we also look at how many actually do make the transfer and what's their GPA, how many hours did they bring into this transfer? You know, how many were retained 2 years after that, who graduates in the 4 years after, in a true 4-year window, who graduates in 6 years. So these data points are outcome data, long time outcome data. And so when we're thinking about the NASH world and how we do data, which I'll elaborate more on, it's going to look a little different. But we base it on this because this is how we're measured nationally, right? In higher education today, we know that they track enrollment trends. We know we're looking at retention and persistence rates. We look at completion. We're also looking at things like debt load and salary, compare, you know, what the starting salaries for folks once they graduate. And so when we think about the why of that, some of it goes back to articles like you see this picture here that NASH shares a lot in their trainings around an article that was published years ago about the value of a higher ed. Well, we all in this room know we value higher ed and we should value higher ed, and all the reasons for that, because that economic mobility that a degree provides is crucial for the family, for the student, and for the family, and for the community, really, and for the nation. So when we think about the metrics that we're using, they are really talking to how the value of an education plays out for the individual who is earning it. And that's super important, right? We need to know those pieces, especially so that we're not losing ground. But when we think about improvement science and the rate at which we're turning over these tests and we're learning new things, you know, if you're waiting for what I frequently reference as autopsy data, you don't know how you got there. That's kind of the problem. And so one of the things that improvement science is wonderful in is that because of its speed and because you're collecting data along the way, and that is actionable data, that is in progress data that you have at the end of 45 days, you very quickly gain knowledge on how something can work and how to make it work reliably across diverse contexts and populations. And it's really played out in practice. You know, we have this little saying we say all the time in improvement science land about knowledge is only a rumor until it lives in the muscle. And so that's very true. The muscle is your test of change and the data associated with it. So at the end of those data points, as you go through your tests and you collect your data along the way, you're building your knowledge. And so you're building your muscle, right? And so the other one that's not captured on the slide that I say regularly is that change moves at the speed of trust, right? And one way to build trust is to have the data points to prove that what you're doing is actually moving the needle the way that we need it to move for our students and for their success. So you may or may not be familiar with Edward Demings. And so he is frequently referenced as the father of improvement science. And these are just some of his favorite quotes. In God we trust, all others must bring data. And so we say that a lot because anecdotally, we know things from the students that we talk to, or that we were privileged to serve, or that we engage with regularly. What we don't know is the other 85% of students who we don't get that option with. We don't have the opportunity. And so that's why we need the data, right? So you have to have something to start. You have to have your baseline. And then once you start into thinking about this, and how does improvement science really work? Like, you know, you have to learn the system. You develop this appreciation for the system. You focus on the parts and how they relate to one another towards that specific aim. We understand why we're getting variation because we're studying the process, we're studying the data, we're studying the outcomes, and we know when something didn't work, we know why it didn't work. We create these theories and knowledge around appreciation of how to make predictions based on previous data. We might do that using a run chart or a graph. And then we have to get to a place where we understand psychologically the interpersonal and the social structures that are impacted by performance or system change or system new process, right? And so it is a little bit of a learning curve when you start making changes on how to think about that change, not just from your current 6 students that you're working with, but then how do we begin as a institution, as a system, to start adding in a different subpopulation of students, or we expand it to 100 students, or maybe the next jump is 200 students, and eventually we get to 80% of all the students. And so along those ways, all 4 of these key elements, you kind of have to go back and you have to revisit, or you have to think about a little bit more or a little bit differently to ensure that you are really tracking that you don't cause harm, that we're doing all the right things in the right direction for the students. So I'm going to hit pause, and I'm going to give an opportunity for questions or thoughts from anyone on the call before we jump into how we're doing things currently and how improvement science is different. Okay, great. Currently, what we usually do is we have more of a top-down approach to change, right? So you may have an institution where you have a large board, or maybe you have a small board, maybe it's the president, just the leadership, senior leadership around the table, and they'll start doing strategic planning. And it's, well, we are aware of these trends, or our deans have brought this forward, or our program directors have brought this forward, or whatever, however they get their data to start the process. And so the strategic planning typically goes from the top down, and that's not always a bad thing, but it definitely is not the approach of improvement science, because by the time that the strategic plan is created and thought out, most of it's set on, a 16-week approach. It's a semester-based approach. Maybe now, as time has kind of evolved around, post-pandemic, we're a little better at capturing things that we're doing in real time with data points. But when we get to the end of that pilot, a lot of times we kind of go, gosh, I don't know how we got there. I don't know where it failed. I don't know, was that at 8 weeks in? Did we take a pulse point at 10 weeks in? We don't really know how we succeeded either, right? So it's not just the failures. You don't really know how or why it was successful. And so the worst part of that to me is when you start hearing folks who go, well, that didn't work. Oh, we'll just go back to the old way of doing things. I've outlived this bad idea, and I'll outlive the next one too. I may or may not have said that a time or two at a different life juncture, just saying. So we don't really think of it that way in improvement science. Improvement science is from the ground up. So when you move into the improvement science world, we usually bring to the table folks who are the closest to the student, whether it's the advisor, a success coach. Frequently it's someone from admissions, someone from financial aid, could be a registrar. And then we do also bring in someone with positional authority to make change. And the reason we do that is when you look at your data, because it's the rear view data, you need to hear where the people who are closest to the student see opportunities, because that's where your tests of change come from, right? They're the ones who are listening day in and day out to a percentage of students, which gives them an insight into where there's opportunity to improve. And so you start very small, there's follow-up tests. That may take years. Frequently in improvement science, you must sit in the river of discomfort, because letting that water of time just wash you over is the only way to eventually get to scale, right? And so as you're moving through this process, through your PDSA cycles, you are learning more, right? So you're not testing to know who's right or wrong, you're testing for knowledge. And so as you build your knowledge and you move towards scale, you can alter, you can do tweaks. And what ends up happening, because there's such large scale buy-in, is you hear people frequently say, well, let's do that again. Or is there another problem we can solve? Or let me lead the next round. And I'm going to give you a real life example of this that came out of the very first NIC. One of their tests of change was on skilling up non-faculty advisors to work with students in the time period that faculty were away from their desk for contract. You know, it was summer. And there was a lot of students who were hanging out in the admissions pipeline who really needed to work with an advisor, but their faculty were away on summer break. And so WKU decided to skill up folks, train them up, and it was really only supposed to be 11 students. That was who was kind of left in the limbo. And the group who stepped in and did that advising work turned around and went back to the campus lead and said, gosh, that was great. Can we call other people? Can we call more students that are left in the limbo and not just our partner school? And they're like, yeah, I'll do that. And so what ended up happening was they got exponentially more students to transfer because someone did some outreach. And we all go, well, yeah, that's kind of an easy ask. That's the beauty and improvement science. It is a kind of easy ask. And so because you had such great success, then you can explore that and you can play with that and see if you can do that in other advising windows and see if that works. And then it leads to greater conversation. And what we call that is organic spread. So because the early successes were so powerful, more people want to come to the table and they want to be involved. And then that organic spread just happens. And so it's a very, very beautiful moment when that takes place. The ultimate goal here is to get away from what we call a reactive change to a fundamental change. And the ATM story is absolutely the best example of this that I have to offer today. So when you think about ATM machines and when they very first started, you would go to the machine and you would put your debit card in, you would put in your PIN, and the machine would dispense whatever amount of money that you requested, provided you had it in your account. And then you took your money and then the machine gave your card back. And then people forgot to get their card. So Monday morning over the weekend, the bank would come in and there would be like a stack of debit cards from folks who forgot to take their card out of the machine. So somebody goes, we need a solution to this. We're getting too many cards retained. And so what ends up happening then is that the machine is altered so that you must remove your card before it will dispense money. Well, that's great, but that's a reactive change, right? So we had a problem, we came up with a solution, but what if there was a way to really fundamentally redesign the whole process to where we're not putting a card in to start with at all? So the card never actually leaves the consumer's hand. Great, let's tap the machine. Let's do the tap and then hit the buttons, but that card never leaves the person's hand. That's a fundamental change. So when you think about transfer, and we're thinking about reactive changes, that may be just when you offer advising hours. Maybe you play with a weekend, right? You suspect that your adult learners are working during the same time that you're in your office, wanting to do advising to help them complete paperwork and transfer, or they need to come in and talk to the financial aid office, whatever that might be. So great, let's do a Saturday. Let's do an evening. Let's set up a team call. Let's do all these things. That's a reactive change. But what if, just what if, we started small and we thought about a group of students who are in a non-competitive major who have already said they're coming to our institution, and we pre-populate their schedules before they graduate in that last semester so that when they graduate from their KCTCS institution in May, they have their schedule in hand for the fall. Wow. Now that's a game changer. We actually did that with the NIC that's currently running, right? So that does take a lot of behind the scenes work with an in-progress electronic sent transcript between the two institutions. So now we're building communication muscle and we're working together as a team to take out a barrier so that the student doesn't even have to really think about it. We have evaluated their transcript because they have expressed interest to come to the institution and given permission for that. So now that student transfer is not an opt-in, it is an opt-out. So that's a fundamental change, right? So we can get there. We can get there. Getting out of the box, we can get there. I already talked about this a little bit, so I'm going to skip that slide. But if you just kind of think about reactive is when you make a change to respond to a problem, but a fundamental change is when you revamp the process so there is no problem, right? That's the easiest way to remember that. Think about your institution for just a moment. I'm not going to ask you to put it in the chat, even though it says it does. I just want you to think on it. When you think about your specific institution and you're thinking about transfer, and you think about, go into your last, I don't know, year's memory, and think about a change that was made in regards to an attempt to improve transfer. Maybe it was successful, maybe it wasn't, but there was this attempt at a change. When you look at it now that you have heard the difference in fundamental and reactive, where do you feel that sits? Was it a reactive change? Was it a fundamental change? How do you know? Ask yourself the question, what part of the process did you change? If the answer is we didn't change the process, we changed a practice, more than likely you did a reactive change. If you redid the process, or, and a lot of folks really don't think about this too much, so I want to elevate it just so I can call it out specifically. Sometimes it's not adding something to a process that improves it. Most of the time it's taking something away. So if you're taking something off the process, maybe it was cumbersome, maybe it was duplicative, maybe it was just completely unnecessary, that could be a fundamental change. So think about those pieces, right? Think about that. Because what we want to do as we evolve as a system, as a community of learning, as community practice, we want to think about ways that we can really, really hone in on getting to a fundamental change, because at the end of the day, that's how we get more students to transfer. We don't really want reactive, maybe what we call necessary but not sufficient, right? There's a lot of groundwork you have to lay before you can ever get to fundamental change. So that necessary work, which might be a check sheet, it might be part of a website, it could be a communication plan, it could be a lot of things, really sets that table beautifully for you to get to that fundamental change. So don't discredit them, but you want to eventually get that foundation set and then start planting your flags towards fundamental change. So we're happy to talk about that as we're building towards an actual work session. So these are just some how do you know examples around reactive change and fundamental change, right? So we've talked about that a little bit. I'll just kind of hit the highlights for you. If you're thinking about financial aid and you need a reactive change, you may actually extend the deadline or helping many students try to navigate that. But the fundamental change of that could be redesigning the process to be simpler or something that's automated, better aligned with admissions, right? So you kind of see the difference there. And how do we do all this work, right? So this is not complicated. Like, I feel very confident in my skills at this point, 4 years into it, to use these frameworks and tools. And really, they're a lot simpler than they're going to seem. So we start with what's called an aim statement, right? And so when you're trying to think about an aim statement, when we launched the first Kentucky NIC to participate with NASH, we aligned ourselves to the NASH goal. And the reason we did that is because it fit beautifully with Kentucky's 2030 goal. So there wasn't really a huge need, I guess is the best way to say that, for a variance or something different. But on your particular campus and your specific ideas around transfer, you probably want what's called a nesting aim statement. So you may have an aim statement that aligns to the 2030 kind of concept, but you're going to write an aim statement that nests underneath that connects what your institutional priorities are for transfer to that 2030 goal. And so when we're thinking about writing this aim statement, I just implore you to really think about what is your campus priorities, how does that connect to transfer, what is already kind of going on in that space, and how can you support and uplift that. And so and that can look a whole lot of different ways. Like, we could talk about that whole thing for an entire community practice meeting about how to tie all that together. But when you're thinking about that and you're writing your aim statement, you have to remember that you can use only what you have as the best available knowledge. Who you bring to that table is critical. You want to bring everyone from your absolute frontline, first engaging with that student, all the way up to the provost if possible. And sit around that and think about that, because what you're really doing with the aim statement is you're setting a goal. And my nudge to folks all the time about this is to think about what really is the goal of your goal, right? And that sounds kind of convoluted, but if you're looking to improve transfer, don't throw a pie in the sky up there and go, we're going to do 50%. We're going to improve this 50%, because that's probably not reality. 7% is very lofty. Most first attempts at improvement is somewhere between 3 and 5 or 5 to 7, depending on how much of that infrastructure is built. But all these aim statements, when you're building them, you will have to talk about what is to be improved. What is that clear, we all agree to this definition, right? Because you don't want any ambiguity. I never said that word right. You don't want to be ambiguous, right? You want to make sure that everybody who's at the table understands when we say this, we mean that, and we all agree this is what we're going to be working towards. Who are we trying to support? By how much, that measurable amount, and how much time do we have? So 2030 goal, perfect. You've got 5 years. That's a great time frame, because when you're doing the aim statement, that is your broad overarch to really get into what your goal is that you're trying to establish. And that will be super important, because that's how you're going to connect your drivers, how you figure out what big buckets of work we can do to achieve that goal, which is why you need to know what is the goal of your goal, right? So you see Kentucky's statement here. We intend by May of 2030 for students who enroll at a two-year institution to transfer and complete a baccalaureate will increase by 7%. And at that time, it was within 6 years. Now, of course, it needs to be updated just to say 5 years. But it's just a nice hand and glove fit. But for your institution, this may be your overarching aim, but then you want that nesting aim. How are you going to do that? What part of this? Maybe you're looking to increase non-traditional transfer. Maybe it's veteran transfer. Whatever it is becomes your aim statement that fits underneath here, right? By when, for whom, how much will it improve? And so now that you know a little bit more about aim statements, take a stab at thinking about writing one for a transfer related need on your campus, right? So if you know, I don't know, let's say that students at your institution are not transferring, especially if you're with KCTCS. You want to increase the number of students who are with an AA or an AS making the jump and completing a transfer. Or if you're at a four-year institution, perhaps you want to retain more. Maybe you have students who are making the jump, but then you're losing them sometime in that first semester. If you think about whatever your priority problem is, what aim statement would you write? And take a stab at it. We're going to give you 5 minutes. We're actually going to pause for 5 minutes. I've got a little clock running. And try to write one. And when you're finished writing it, step back from it and go, now, what was the goal of my goal? What was it I really wanted to say in this aim statement? And did I get that onto paper? Okay, so we've got a 5-minute break to think about it. It is 2:38. We will come back at 2:43.
Can you share the elements of the aim statement again, Beth Ann?
You got it. There we go. Couple more minutes. I just typed one out in the chat and I'll pop it in after we have a chance to talk.
Beth, I'm working on one as well, and I just had a quick question. So do folks typically, is it recommended that they obtain kind of a baseline of their metric before developing the aim? Okay. 'Cause
Absolutely.
I'm thinking for folks who haven't had a chance to yet, or maybe don't have direct access. I know for the aim statement that I wrote, right, it might be the goal isn't so much relative. For instance, the example says increase by 7%. It might just be obtain a goal of, but it's hard to know what's realistic, right? Unless you have at least some idea of where you're starting
Absolutely.
from.
We would,
Okay.
any improvement work would begin with a review of baseline data of just in general, right? So this is the transfer data related to institution X, whether it's, a 2-year, 4-year, we just would look at the broad picture. Then teams will do a process mapping, right? So then you have your baseline, you understand, now you need to understand why you're getting the data you're getting, right? Systems are designed to get the results they get. So if you want a different system, you have to redesign the system. So we have to process map it. So for this purpose, we're just broadly practicing that we pretend we know all things about our data, and this could be based on a conversation you had with a student that, well, I'm a 26-year-old student who has a child at home and I'm working full time, but I really need that bachelor's degree, right? So I know that adult learners or non-traditional students transfer at lower rates because I've reviewed my data, right? So that's kind of, and I'll go ahead and let our group chime back in because we're over time. We're at time actually right now at the 5-minute window if anyone wants to share their aim statement. But we all know that we want to improve economic mobility for our students. And so having students who are non-traditional working parents to actually be able to get that associate's degree and then go on to transfer to a baccalaureate degree is such an economic mobility mover. It's just a huge thing for them to do, but they so infrequently do that. So that's always a target. I'm going to read Saunders here. You fleshed yours way out. Way to go. Nice job. So mine is just very brief because let's get into our driver. So Sandra gets the A for being ahead. She got it and went ahead. So here's mine.
I cheated.
Hypothetically, I'm at a 4-year institution and the aim is to increase the number of non-traditional transfers. That's an institutional priority, right? So I've talked to folks at my institution. I know that we have a lot of native students. We have a lot of traditional age students. We have a lot of traditional age transfers, but we are really looking to improve the number of adult learners who make a transfer and come to the institution. So an example would be by May 2030, the percentage of in-state non-traditional students who enrolling at a KCTCS institution complete the degree and then transfer on to complete a baccalaureate degree within 6 years will increase by 3%. That's a pretty lofty goal for that particular subgroup, for that particular student demographic. It's a pretty lofty goal. Thanks, Kristen. It is important, though, like you said, to know your data. And then once we have this, then the next piece of this pie in the diagram, let me get us on over to here, is to think about how do we use that data to establish the metrics and the measure. And that gets us into some other tools we're probably not going to get to today. That's upcoming in the future. But it certainly is very helpful when we start thinking about a driver's diagram and we start thinking about that process map I referenced. And those are our kind of jumping off point to have these other conversations. So thank you for playing along. I appreciate that. Let's take a little sneak peek at what that would be like. So as we mentioned, that driver's diagram kind of sets the table for the rest. So what we would do as a team is we would, now that we have a baseline, we have a hypothetical situation with an aim, we will look at, from the various lens at the table, what do we think will move the needle, right? How are we going to actually achieve that? How are we going to get there? And so we will do sticky notes all over the wall. And it is every idea under the sun that people who are at differing levels of involvement with students have on how to improve this specific target. And then we basically synthesize that, and we try to get it down to 2 primary drivers. Although this example has 4, it's usually only 2, because you can word those broad enough that you can get to 2. And then when you look at those 2, now we're going to process map, right? We start this whole, how does a student begin at that Kentucky Community Technical College? How does that student go across the transfer pipeline there? How does that application look? How does the student make the jump to the 4-year they're intending to go to? Where are the touch points? Where is there an opportunity? And very quickly you start seeing where there is great opportunity to be better and closer connected on helping students make this journey, because it's like, oh, well, we could have done that. We could have collaborated on that, or we could have shared that piece of communication out. And so that process map is not simple. They are actually very difficult. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that that's an easy process, because pretty soon you start seeing decision points. It might be a yes. Well, if it's a yes, it goes one way. If it's a no, it goes back the other way. And so when you see a process map, this example is very simplistic, and it's honestly not fair. It's very much more complicated, but it's such a worthwhile process, because the process map honestly will elevate about 85% of anything that is duplicative. You will get into things that you are like, well, why are we doing that? I mean, I hear that regularly. Why is that part of this? And the answer is, this is the time to do the 5 whys. You ask yourself why 5 times as to why this is really taking place, whatever the practice is, the policy might be. And pretty soon, what you learn at the end of 5 whys is, well, we've just always done it that way. Or here's the legitimate reason why we need to. And a lot of times when it comes to financial aid, it's a legality. So you have to do it. But that 5 why process as part of your mapping is crucial when it gets into figuring out where things are really either accelerating the process or bogging down a process. So it's a beautiful thing. I just have to ask you to be patient as your teams would move through that, because it does take some time. And what comes out on the other side of that is where you start your PDSA cycles, right? So we have our aim, we have our known primary drivers, what we really think will move that needle, and now we're ready to start testing. And you're like, well, Beth, that driver's diagram has secondary drivers on it. You didn't mention those. Yeah, that's because we don't know them yet, right? So that's where your testing comes in. So if you're a brand new improvement science team, you are developing your secondary drivers through your test of change, right? As you do your test of change and things elevate as working, and you're testing multiple times with multiple institutions through multiple lenses with students, pretty soon you know that a secondary driver, for an example, is reducing the time between applicant to enrolled. We know that. That's like well tested through NASH. We've tested that over 4 years. But when we started this work as a new NIC, or what's called a prototype NIC, we didn't know what secondary drivers were. So you're building your knowledge. Remember going back to how long does it take to get to a best practice, and looking at how you build that knowledge. This is how we do it. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully, I know we're kind of getting up against time. We got about 10 minutes, and we are kind of to the end of this conversation. And I want to be sure to leave this open for some conversation and some questions. But as you can tell, the more you do it and the more you see the good and the beauty and the change and the benefit the students get, the more exciting this work becomes. I've been doing it for years, and I'm more passionate about it now than I was the day I started it, because it is such a safe way to really move the needle and the trajectory for the student, so that more students achieve that ultimate goal of getting their degree, their baccalaureate degree. So that's it for me. I'm going to answer any questions. And I'm always, my email, I'll pop it in the chat. I know it's in here another place, but I'm always happy to connect and talk more about any of this if anyone on the call wants to do that. Okay, Elizabeth, I'm a little curious. What's a wig project?
Our college does 4DX, so I've been kind of lumped in with the advising department, and we're given massive lists of students to contact.
Mm.
And I can't even keep up with that, plus do my regular job. So,
I understand. I just had never heard of a wig project. So it's basically like a retention calling strategy. I'm just trying to.
well, um, wildly important goals. Um,
Okay.
40X is a whole improvement process in itself, a different model. We had gotten rid of it because it's extremely expensive to subscribe to the progress boards and stuff that they sell.
Okay.
But our president is enthusiastic about it. Um, so like we
Hmm.
had a faculty vote to get rid of it. And the staff survey came back in, to get rid of it because it really is interfering with people's ability to get their jobs done. But
Totally
I,
understand.
I just keep up with it the best I can.
That's all you can do. I appreciate you sharing that. I was really just curious. I thank you for entertaining that and helping me learn a little bit more. And I certainly understand time commitment and being one human. So, right now doesn't mean not ever. And so hopefully someday it will turn into, yes, I can do that now. But hopefully in the meantime, you find a way and it means it's not so overwhelming because that's very tough. I'll be thinking about you. Um, there are some Stephanie's question about suggestions about engagement, continuous improvement, but challenges with limited time and resources. There actually is a really good way to balance all of this. So part of what is in an improvement community is that you frequently have what's called a travel team. It's a very small group, usually no more than 3 per institution. But then you have a home team, and your home team can be 100 if you really wanted it to, although I would probably just pass out if I saw 100 people around the table. But the home team is really a way and means of taking those great, wonderful ideas and breaking them down into a bite. So one person will do one task, or one person might measure one thing, and another person does something altogether different. And it makes the lift a shared collaborative lift. And really, that's the best way to do it, honestly, because then you get all this really team building and trust building, and you're working to do this as a cohesive unit, and it feels owned by the whole team instead of just one person. So if you really have an interest in this and you really think it might be a game changer for your campus, just the process, even if it's not in transfer, if it's just the process, so that you can get more organic kind of spread of work to improve processes for students, I'm happy to talk to you about that and how to stage that so that it's not so overwhelming. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think I just have a couple of kind of closing out slides here. But yes, please do get in touch with Beth if you are curious and would like to learn more. I always find every time I hear Beth, you speak about improvement science, I learn something new, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity. So folks, in the chat, I just dropped the link to our feedback form. We would really encourage you to take a minute, I think max. There are a couple questions about what your thoughts were on our session today. If you found the topic maybe a little bit too basic or beginner friendly, maybe you found it too advanced or just right. It's kind of like a Goldilocks assessment, although I've never thought of it that way. We would love to hear from you just so we can tailor our next session to be an even better fit. So please take a moment to do that before you hop off this call. You've got about 4 minutes before the end of the hour. And in terms of what is coming up next, we have our October session, which we will be rescheduling because it overlaps with a conference some of us may be attending. So I will also include in the chat for you a meeting poll. If you are interested in NICS, what we are going to be doing in our October session, is to have a more intimate conversation, right? Maybe pull out some of those draft aim statements that you are all working on today. Maybe talk about another barrier towards NIC, or a barrier towards being able to find the time and resources, right, to engage in some of the improvement science work. And we can workshop that with each other. So that is the plan for October. If you are interested in maybe playing with some ideas or exchanging best practices with colleagues, talking through, wrestling through some of the challenges you've been working on or celebrating some of those successes as it relates to Nick or otherwise, I encourage you to fill out the poll. And then what we can do is try to find a substitute time or rescheduling time for October that fits your schedule. All right. So that's what we will be covering in October. Beth will be back. Some of us had some sample or draft aim statements in the chat, which we could lean on as well. And then in November, we will be taking a retrospective look back at what we've covered in our COP kind of to date. So I don't think we'll commit to sharing all of the content, but maybe like one slide for each month. And that will be your kind of year-end round out. And we'll also be sharing back some data on attendance trends, which topics folks seem to engage with the most, some ideas that we've collected along the way throughout the year about what we can do to change up the frequency or the focus of our communities of practice. Right. So again, they align with what you find adds the most value for you. So it'll be a little bit of a report out from our end. And then again, asking you all as our community members, right, how would you like to be supported in the next year? How can we create more space for you all to share with each other? Is this group maybe too large, again, too small, just right? Would we like more breakouts by role, right, or by institution type? How do you get plugged into the groups that already exist so you can find your people, right, and that safe space to continue to learn and grow? So that's going to be November. And then December is, again, just a final check-in, peer-to-peer, right? That one's more so agenda-free. But if you are not on holidays yet, right, or you want to talk about some holiday plans or just connect for a final kind of farewell before the end of the year, maybe get some transfer things off your mind, right? So you're able to go home, rest and recharge. That is our space for you to do so. And we will be hosting that kind of community conversation on December 10th. All right. So I think that's it for today. Of course, you always have our contact information. You're welcome to reach out. I will stick to my offer at the start of the session. If you're curious about NACAC or you'd like to hear about what some of the topics they covered were, they had Brene Brown as the opening keynote, but I'm happy to just kind of share back some of my learnings if you're curious. But otherwise, we wish you a great rest of the day. Feel free to hang on if you have some questions about what we talked about today. Otherwise, we will see you at our next session. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.